During gym class, I fell and broke my head. They took me to the nurse's office where I would come in, vomit, and then pass out again. This occurred multiple times. I recall seeing my father's employee seated on a chair adjacent to the cot where I was laying. My father disliked me and couldn't be bothered to go to school when they phoned, so he dispatched his employee. My stepmother was at the hairdresser at the time, and they couldn't reach her. I recall my father's employee sitting towards the front of the gurney on which I was laying. He was pressed against the wall between the ambulance's front and back doors, peering through the small window in the wall. He requested the driver if he could turn off the siren because it was causing him anxiety. He hadn't even looked at me once. He was the one who was nervous, not me. That made me laugh. Anyway, things might go dark now and then, but I'd be aware of everything around me again. When the ambulance arrived at the hospital, a man unlocked the rear door and pushed my gurney out, and then everything went black again. The next thing I remember is being hurled down a lengthy corridor at high speed. When we got to the end of the hall, the person pulling my gurney almost came to a halt and turned sharply into this large room. Because there were so many curtains covering the wall to the right of the doorway, it reminded me of the school cafeteria. The person pushing my gurney turned it sideways and began bringing it, headfirst, to a place to the left of the door. The gurney came to a halt in front of this enormous metal structure. It captivated me and reminded me of a large metal dinosaur. Of course, I know it was an X-ray machine, but I'd never had an X-ray before, so I had no idea what it was. I was inspecting the big machine when I was distracted by clanging noises. The X-ray machine, by the way, was to my right and slightly past the head of the gurney. I was facing the door, well down and to the right of the gurney at the moment. The clanging came from behind the gurney and to the left. My attention was drawn away from the dinosaur by the noise, and I turned to see two men in hospital uniforms hurrying around. They both appeared to be fairly short, standing between 5'4" and 5'6" tall. One was Caucasian, with a fair complexion and blonde hair with a receding hairline. The other appeared to be Hispanic in origin. He had dark skin, black hair, and was balding. The white man was the shortest, and a touch heavier for his size than the dark-haired man, but they were both in good shape. One man wore a silver stretch band watch, while the other sported a black leather band watch. I used to recall which man was wearing which watch, but that part of my memory has faded with time. The males were playing with what appeared to be handheld blackboards, or slates. I was overjoyed since a handheld blackboard with chalk had been my favorite Christmas present when I was 4 or 5 years old. I was interested in what they were doing with them. It made no sense to me because neither of them had any chalk. What good is a blackboard if it isn't used? While I was still looking at the two men, a disturbance at the door diverted my attention away from them. I turned around to see an Indian from India doctor enter with my father's employee close behind. It's beyond my comprehension how I knew the man was a doctor, but I did. The doctor and the other man were standing against the wall, near the curtains and windows. The doctor was staring at me, and the man who worked for my father was attempting to persuade him to buy a car. Even though he kept a straight face the entire time, I could sense what the doctor was experiencing. He was furious and outraged with the man for even considering selling a car, as I lay on the other side of the room, maybe dying. In any event, I was uninterested in the two of them and returned to see what the two men with the blackboards were up to. I moved back towards the door after hearing another noise coming from it. My stepmother was there. She stepped into the room, stopping several feet in front of the doctor and my father's employee, with a, "Please, someone give me some good news," expression on her face. My father's employee appeared terrified, so he went to the doctor and said, "You tell her, Doc." The doctor then informed my stepmother they did not expect me to survive the night. My stepmother let out a horrific scream and began to faint at that point. My father's employee ran up and caught her so she didn't fall to the ground. I was irritated. I couldn't understand why the doctor would say something like that to her. Look at me as I yelled, "Don't listen to him, Mom. I'm okay." She couldn't seem to hear me for some inexplicable reason. I kept yelling, but she ignored me. Then, without thinking, I thought, oh, she can't hear me like this. I'm not sure why I said that or what I meant. I must have been aware that I was not in my bodily body. I'm not sure how I knew. All I can think of is that the form I was in must have been recognizable to me. Maybe that's why I wasn't terrified when I realized I was in a shape different than human. In any event, the moment I spoke it, I felt like I was being pulled down through a vacuum cleaner hose. I could feel the air swirling around me. Then I had a hard crash landing into my body, and the second I got back into it, I began wiggling, trying for a way out. I kept telling myself that I needed to get out of there because my body was so cold, hard, heavy, and constraining. Surprisingly, I had not considered how I felt when out of my body until I returned to it and had something to compare it to. I felt liberated while out of my body, as if I had no restrictions. At first, it appeared that I was a part of everything, and that everything was a part of me, as if we had melted together and become one, but I was still a separate creature. That may sound perplexing, but it is how I felt. There was also this amazing sense of warmth. Not the warmth of temperature, but the warmth of love. The closest thing I can think of is when my 4-year-old daughter walked in to use the restroom. At the moment, I was seated on the sofa. Instead of returning to her play, she went over to me, put her small arms around my neck, and whispered, "Mommy, I love you," for no apparent reason. When she did that, a warm warmth raced down my spine from head to toe. Still trying to get out of my body, the sound of my stepmother crying drew my attention once more. I put my discomfort aside and resumed my efforts to calm her down. I attempted to open my mouth to call to her, but it wouldn't open for some reason. I didn't know why, but I figured it has something to do with my fall. I assumed that because I couldn't speak. I just waved my arms back and forth until she noticed me. I assumed if she saw me waving my arms, she'd realize I was fine and stop weeping. My arms, however, refused to move. They felt like they were encased in cement, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move them. Undaunted, I thought that if my arms would move, I'd kick her feet until she noticed. But they were as heavy as cement, and I couldn't move them either. At that moment, I became scared and switched my attention back to myself, forgetting about my stepmother. I tried wiggling the toes on one of my feet, but they were as immobile. Then I tried wiggling the ones on the other foot, and they did the same. I worried at that time, fearing that the fall had rendered me paralyzed. Everything went black instantly, and that's all I remember until I awoke over a month later. When I awoke, I noticed my stepmother reading a magazine on a chair next to my bed. I turned around and said, "I'm starving. Can you get me something to eat?" She was taken aback. She leapt up and dashed out the door to find a nurse. The nurse examined me and she summoned the doctor. For the following few hours, interns, doctors, and nurses came and departed from my room. I felt like a freak in the middle of a freak show. When the activity subsided, I was relieved to get some alone time with my stepmother. I apologized for causing her to cry. She was perplexed and inquired as to what I was on about. I described how she cried when the doctor informed her I wasn't expected to survive the night when she initially arrived at the hospital. My stepmother continued telling me that I couldn't possibly have known those things. She said that I passed out in the ambulance before arriving at the hospital. I had no notion what a coma was, but I knew she was mistaken. We debated about it briefly, and then, to establish my point, I told her exactly what she was wearing when she came. I remember that to this day. She was dressed in a sleeveless, baby blue knit jumper with a low waist. There was a band around her waist that sat on her hips, and there were pleats all around from the band down. I explained that she was wearing identical high heels and carrying a white patent leather purse. At that point, she gave me a frightening look and maintained that I couldn't possibly have known, and she stated she didn't want to talk about it again. As a result, we never did. While I was performing my chores, I had the impression that someone was observing me. When I turned around, there was my stepmother, staring a hole in me. I'd implore her to please stop, but she'd only shake her head and walk away, saying I wasn't the same person since my injury, meaning the fractured skull. Surprisingly, after the fracture, I began seeing and/or hearing spirits, but that's another story. In any event, as a result of this encounter, I have no fear of death. In fact, I'm looking forward to feeling free and warm once more.